The ocean bed is home to thousands of cables that carry an untold amount of secure government and financial information. But they are vulnerable, and following the recent threat of blowing up the Nord Stream pipeline, the nations of Northern Europe are getting nervous, and they're joining together to do something about it. Welcome to Roundtable. I'm Philip Hampshire. 10 northern European countries of the British-led Joint Expeditionary Force are turning their attention to protecting undersea and offshore infrastructure. The reason is much of the world's data is carried via undersea fiber optic cables, which are theoretically vulnerable to enemies with the ability to cut them. In an era of increased conflict, which has already seen the Nord Stream pipeline mysteriously blown up, there are concerns about what the consequences would be if the globe's emails, banking transactions, and even national defense systems were suddenly switched off. So, how big is the risk? And is it even possible to keep underwater infrastructure safe from rivals with bad intentions? So let's meet our guests. I'm joined in the studio today by Chris Phillips. He's former head of the National Counter-Terrorism Security Office here in the United Kingdom. Meanwhile, in Cork, in Ireland, we have Professor Christian Boyga. He is a maritime security expert at the University of Copenhagen. And in Massachusetts, in the United States, is Julian Rall. He's an expert in the undersea fiber optic cable industry at Julian Rall Consulting. Right, well, Chris, let me start with you. How safe do you think the underwater infrastructure is? I'm going to break it out between the underwater infrastructure and the on-the-surface infrastructure. But if we start out with undersea cables, because the internet is really what people are thinking about here, isn't it?
Well, the internet is the most vital part of our infrastructure these days, that and energy. And of course, anything that runs under the sea is going to have its own vulnerabilities. But I would say that the sea is a massive place. The oceans are huge. To find a cable in the middle of the ocean would be very difficult. But of course, those cables come towards land. And when they come towards land, I think they become more vulnerable. But it's still an onerous task to try and deliberately attack one of those cables.
Are the cables not perfectly mapped out then across the sea floor? Similar to the way that you can go on Google Maps and you can sort of look at roads and streets and airports and that kind of thing. The cables, the locations are mostly sort of hidden so long as they're deep under the water.
Yeah, I think it's a difficult one. I mean, that's probably a better question for your other guests. But for me, this is about, the oceans are huge. The difficulty of attacking an undersea cable once it gets into the deep ocean would be very difficult. As it becomes closer to land, you know where the receiving stations are, so those are probably more likely to be an attack vector.
Christian, let's take this across to you. How vulnerable do you think that the cables are, both under the water and, of course, at the nodal points where they come to the surface and they link in with the mainland infrastructure?
Cables are basically the fundamental infrastructure of our digital economies. They are actually quite well taken care of. We have to acknowledge that they break about 100 times a year. Usually they get fixed relatively quickly. But quite obviously, if we are looking at scenarios with large-scale cable failures, then we would be in trouble.
Julian, what is it that you see as being the main thing that people need to focus on when it comes to security of these undersea cables? If their locations are already quite difficult to get to, why is everyone worried about them?
Well, I certainly agree with Chris that cables deep in the ocean are difficult to attack in any way. They're deep in the water and they're difficult to find. Even when we're trying to effect repairs, we do have as-laid maps of the cables, so we know basically where to look, but underwater currents can move cables over the seabed. And when we get closer to shore, the cables are generally buried because 80% of the outages caused to cables are by fishing gear and ship anchors. So under 1,000 meters, we bury the cable in the seabed down to at least a meter. So again, that makes it more difficult to find and attack them. I would agree with you that the nodes are actually the most vulnerable places. So it's really the terrestrial infrastructure that I think we should be most concerned about. The cable landing stations are kept fairly discreet. It's not obvious where they are, and I think that we will continue to do that in the future. I'm reminded of 9/11, a very sad and tragic event. I was in Boston, and one of the towers actually fell down on top of one of the main interconnection points in New York City for all the submarine cables, but it was on land. And that took out all the transatlantic communication on that day. Similarly, the Taiwan earthquake in 2006 took out 22 submarine fiber optic cables and caused major disruption in Asia. But generally speaking, I think it's terrestrial that we should be focused on protecting.
Chris, how vulnerable are these things today? Are they less vulnerable now than they were, say, 10 years ago? People have been talking about concern about these cables and the infrastructure issues that they would have if they were damaged for quite some time, at least 20 years.
Yeah, and I think we need to bear in mind that they do. It's not just one cable. There's any number of cables under the ocean that. So if one breaks, then of course the others are able to step in. The point for me is the nodes, where they come into the land, where we've got a number of centres within London where these interconnectors are coming in and actually being then disseminated across Europe. So those sort of locations are more of a concern. But don't forget, it's not just cables that are undersea. It's also gas and electricity that's nowadays being pushed under the waters.
As we saw with the Nord Stream pipeline issue when that was destroyed. Concerns about these cables and other pieces of infrastructure being destroyed at sea has led to a joint expeditionary force being set up. Several countries have come on board with this. The joint expeditionary force currently contains the United Kingdom, Denmark, Finland, Estonia, Iceland, Latvia, Lithuania, the Netherlands, Sweden, and Norway. It's clearly a concern for all of these countries together. We've talked about the undersea portion of this. There's also the above the sea portion of this, and there's been quite a few developments here, haven't there?
Yeah, and let's not forget the interesting part of this is countries' critical national infrastructure, but it's not actually within the boundaries of the country that's trying to protect it. So there needs to be a worldwide, effectively, a group that are protecting all these sections where they don't come within the land's borders.
Christian, let me bring this across to you. We saw with the destruction a few weeks ago of the Novokakhovka Dam in Ukraine that critical infrastructure is currently in the war in Ukraine being targeted, and of course in other future wars may be targeted as well, even though it's a violation of the 1977 extension of the Geneva Convention.
I think the crucial thing here is that we are living in very different times now. And that is, first of all, we're living in times where there are gray zone attacks happening at sea, where it's very difficult to know whether a state was behind it or whether it was a non-state organization. And that is kind of like the symbol that the Nord Stream attack set. Why we are also living in different times is simply because there's going to be more and more infrastructures at sea. We will depend on it. And the reason that we have something like the expeditionary forces is that the future of the green energy transition lies in the North Sea and the Baltic. Right? We will be increasingly dependent on wind energy, carbon storage, blue hydrogen produced from these areas. So this is massive. And quite obviously, with this massive investment and new independencies comes a lot of new vulnerabilities. At the same time, we are living in an age where it's not only about accidents and failures from extreme weather events that we have to worry about, but also attacks from gray zone tactics, scenarios like we have seen in the Nord Stream attack. But quite obviously, we still do not know who was behind the Nord Stream attack. but it is likely that we're going to see more incidents like this, and we all have to prepare for it.
Well, the point that you've made, there was actually a statement put out by the Joint Expeditionary Force defense ministers who had this to say when they made the announcement about the force being started up. Today we face common challenges, including Russian vessels mapping critical undersea and offshore infrastructure, indicating preparations for possible disruption and, at worst, sabotage. Julian, I'm assuming that that's the kind of thing you're focused on as well.
Well, as we already said, sabotaging a submarine fiber optic cable is pretty difficult to do, certainly in the high seas. Excuse me. Maybe it is more relevant to things like offshore wind farms, possibly even power cables. But the submarine fiber optic cables, I think, the security risk is much more on land at the cable landing station, or indeed at the data center. But I would like to just comment on Christian's point about the new age. What we're facing is a lot more use of the seabed by different interested parties. And so the United Nations has just recently come up with a new agreement called the High Seas Treaty for Biodiversity Beyond National Jurisdiction, or BBNJ for short. And this tries to set out some rules for how different seabed users, particularly mineral use, as well as power infrastructure, how these users are going to interact. And actually the main concern is over maintenance of these different types of infrastructure, because obviously you're maneuvering vessels around the infrastructure, and when you're doing maintenance, you could possibly damage somebody else's infrastructure. So this is something that we are particularly concerned about at the moment, to make sure that people are aware of what other infrastructure is around, and that when we're laying cables, we lay them in a way that leaves enough space between us and other infrastructure to enable maintenance to take place.
Chris, all three of you seem to think that it's very difficult to get to these undersea cables. So why are people so worried?
Well, I think there are people and groups and organisations and countries that would love to do this, but having the capability to do that, that's a different kettle of fish altogether. And I think where we are at the moment is probably nation states could do this, could attack sites. And of course, in any war situation, the first thing that's attacked is the infrastructure. And this is, as we've already discussed, a critical part of the infrastructure. So nation states, they can do it. Terrorist groups, probably not, but of course that doesn't stop them attacking on land. And then you've got the other group, which is organised criminals, that could also make use of this kind of thing. And they've got more money and more availability to do this kind of thing. So there are threats out there. Let's not be too blasé about this.
And there's precedent as well. It has been done before, hasn't it? Although, albeit a long time ago, if we're looking back at World War I, for instance.
Yeah, the first action of World War I was the British cutting the German cables to the US and leaving just one working, which they could then monitor. So there's nothing new about this. This is communications. If you can get into people's communications, you're there. And of course, that's what this is. So there are people and groups and countries that would love to do it, but you have to have the capability, and that's a different thing.
What about Christian's point that it's not simply the undersea cables, it's also things like all the wind turbines that are offshore these days, and therefore you can hit that infrastructure or hit the power cables that are coming off those as well. Is that a subtly different problem, or is it in the same ballpark?
Well, I would suggest that it's probably easier to do that. These gentlemen may well be able to comment on that better. But listen, the key thing here is, you've got to be able to do that. If you don't have the capability to go undersea, you've got to have real specialist equipment.
Christian, if I bring this across to you, how difficult is it to damage the above-the-surface infrastructure as opposed to the deep-sea cables, things like wind turbines that are offshore?
I slightly disagree here. First of all, it's really, really easy to cut a subsea data cable. right? Basically, the two of us, if we go out tomorrow at sea, we get a boat with a big anchor, we can cut the cable, and we also know where they are because they are on maps. Right? And indeed, cables get cut all the time, right? So the point is not that they are very, very well protected and so on. It is just the sheer amount of cables. If you just cut one cable, nothing will really happen. Now, power cables look a little bit different. They are much, much bigger. Internet cable like this, power cable like this, and it's really, really difficult to cut them with an anchor. And there you basically need specialist equipment. Pipelines a little bit easier than power cables. And quite obviously, if we are looking towards the surface, there we have to make a little bit the difference if we are talking about mounted wind farms, which are fixed on the seafloor, or if we're looking at floating wind farms, which are just anchored, right? So there we have different attacks scenarios. Wind farms mainly as future scenario, because 40 to 50% of our energy will come from wind farms from the sea. Today, we should mainly be concerned about many attacks on cables. And here the so-called choke points are super important. If you think about the British Channel, for instance, if you think about the port of Marseille, these are all places where a lot of cables are in very close proximity to each other, and there an attack could actually have quite major consequences. And these are the kind of scenarios we should prepare for and keep in mind when designing critical maritime infrastructure protection strategies.
Well, it's funny that you should mention that you can pull these things up on maps, because one of our producers did. Here is a map of where some of the cables are for the North Atlantic, for instance. So I suppose, Julian, I've got to bring it across to you. Is the first order of business not simply to make these things secret? Or do we need to have them mapped so that people don't accidentally trawl them?
Yeah, no, the fishing community needs to know where these cables are so that they try to avoid trawling over them. Losing their gear to a cable is just as expensive for them as it is for the submarine cable industry. So, no, I don't think keeping them secret to that extent is the answer. As Christian said, building more cables and having more diversity. Yes, there are certainly choke points around the world right now. Christian mentioned a couple. There's the Gulf of Suez and around Alexandria on the Egyptian side, on the Mediterranean side of Egypt, is also a choke point. Singapore is a choke point. But what we're doing now is we are building cables to other locations that can still serve the same markets. For example, in Europe, a lot of the new cables are now going to Spain instead of landing further north in UK, France, or Germany. So that is something that is very much in the minds of cable planners to create more diversity in terms of the hubs. But I would come back to the point that Christian was making about cutting a cable. You know, there are 50 cables serving the UK, for example. You cut one, it's not going to make any difference at all. And to make an analogy with World War I, we always say that the next war is fought with the technology of the previous war and the thinking of the previous war. And so to go back to World War I is really rather preposterous. We have an internet now. Not only do we have diversity in terms of the physical cables, but the way that internet traffic is routed through routers means that there are almost countless ways of rerouting traffic if there's a break in one physical connection. So really, we have more faults than Christian said. We have about 300 faults a year, and there's about 500 commercial cables operating in the world, with about 30 or 40 being added every year. And most of those, 80%, are from fishing gear and anchors.
Julian, does that mean you're not?
It's really not going to make any difference.
So does that mean that you're not worried about this, and that perhaps the concerns are a little bit overstated, because the entire point of the network, when it was set up sort of with a Cold War mentality, was that there would be inherent redundancy in the system. It's a worldwide web, because if you take out one strand of the web, obviously, as you say, everything reroutes. So therefore, is everyone getting a little bit too worked up on this issue, and it shouldn't be quite so front and centre as it has been the last few weeks?
So what I would say is that for years, the submarine cable industry has been trying to attract the attention of governments to the fact that these are strategic assets, and they need to be aware, and they need to be protected. So, I think the industry is very happy that we're now getting the attention that I think these cables need. It's the kind of solutions that are being talked about that may not be necessary, may not be appropriate. But overall, the fact that governments are more aware and that people are more aware of how important these cables are is a good thing.
Now, of course, you were involved with the National Counter-Terrorism Security Office here in the UK. So what kind of recommendations did you put forward with regards to undersea cables?
Well, luckily, undersea cables weren't part of my responsibility, but I think the key point that's been discussed here, and the difference between World War I, if you like, and now, is the redundancy issue. There are other options. In those days, if you cut one or two cables, you could cut a country off. Nowadays, with what's been talked about, that's you're much less able to do that. And I think that's going to be our main sort of area of security, because these cables are going to be cut accidentally, as we've heard, 300 times a year. So it's something that we've got to get used to, but also being very careful to identify what the criticalities are of each part of the organisation.
Now, I have a quote here from Kurt de Winter, who is the director of the Belgian Navy's Maritime Operations Division. Here's what he had to say about the situation. The Nord Stream incident was really a wake-up call for European countries in order to protect more and more offshore infrastructure. We're speaking about communications cables, but also power cables, pipelines for oil and gas. Do you think that this all, Christian, comes out of the Nord Stream situation? And prior to this, well, it was an issue, but we'll stick it on the back burner for now.
No, absolutely. The Nord Stream attack was like 9/11 and counterterrorism. So because of Nord Stream, we are going to see a massive response in terms of protecting critical maritime infrastructures. So wake-up call, absolutely. There's a danger that this is considered to be primarily a military issue in the hands of navies. What it actually requires is Coast Guard. What it will require is close collaboration with the industry. And there's also only a small component, the deterrence component will be actually where we require military forces. So there we need to be a little bit cautious that we are not ending up with thinking that submarines will solve the problem and so on. It requires multi-agency, civil, military, state industry cooperation. And we also need to think a little bit more about who's going to pay for all of that. Is it the taxpayers? Is it the consumers? Or is it the shareholders of the companies that make a lot of money from these infrastructures?
Okay, another issue, I'm going to bring this one across to Julian, of course, is as these are international cables, territorial waters only extend so far off sea. Even if you get into sort of the fullest remit of a country's sort of economic area and stretch it out as far as you can, plenty of these cables are being laid now to go around the Arctic, which is sort of disputed territory between people and quite difficult to get to as well. So what do you do about these cables sort of, if you like, in the middle of nowhere? Does it become the responsibility of the country that put them down, regardless of whether it was put down by a private contractor or by a government? Does it become the responsibility of an international body? What would you like to see here, Julian?
Well, I think there's. You've asked me two questions there. One, what I'd like to see, and what is actually there today. As I mentioned earlier, there is this new high seas agreement arranged by the United Nations, the BBNJ, which addresses responsibilities on the high seas. As you said, the territorial waters go out to 12 miles, and a country's economic zone goes out to 200 miles. But beyond that, Really, it has been a free-for-all. But now that we're starting to actually use the seabed out in the high seas for various activities, the United Nations is acting as a body that can bring everyone together to agree on how we address such issues. But again, as far as submarine fiber optic cables are concerned, if you've got a cable buried laid 5,000 meters under the water, it's practically impossible to take any kind of vessel down to that depth to attack it. I'd say that environment is pretty benign as far as human intervention is concerned.
Julian, Christian, Chris, thank you very much, all three of you, for joining me. I'm afraid that's all we have time for on today's show. Remember, you can see more discussion and debate if you head on over to our YouTube channel. Just go to YouTube and search for Roundtable TRT World. But for now, from me here and the entire team, thank you for watching, and goodbye.